Welcome to HIPSA Presents Hidden History, where we unearth the untold stories that shaped Southern Africa. Our host, Elizabeth van Eenigen, is diving deep into the archives with our guest, David Johnson, editor of ICU, the Industrial and Commercial Workers Unions of Africa.
This podcast concerns the volume that we produced in 2022. This volume on the ICU, which David edited with Henry D. And so that is what we're talking about today. David, the reaction that I've had from some of our members, the immediate reaction is, oh, trade unions, how boring. And I've said, I think that you need to open the volume and dip into it, because to me, this volume is a constant joy. It has a kind of a joyousness, particularly in the earlier period, and also an energy, which is exciting to find in a volume. So I wondered if you could say a little bit about the background to the formation of the ICU and how one should respond to a trade union history.
I mean, I have some sympathy with your readers who hesitated when they were confronted with a volume of trade union documents, because they can certainly be extremely dull. And they are, in the vast amount of publications and texts that were generated in the 1920s about the ICU. There certainly were many that are obviously quite boring to contemporary readers. But I think the fascination of the ICU was simply, as you say, the incredible energy and hope that it embodied. And, you know, if it started in 1919, and had you been living in South Africa in 1919, in Southern Africa, you would never in a million years have predicted that this extraordinary organization would have emerged, flourished, and survived for 10 years. They were very, very unpropitious times straight after the First World War. Levels of poverty, joblessness, escalating racial polarization, very tough times. And yet within this unpromising terrain, you had the emergence of this incredible, one big union, driven by the syndicalist idealism, socialist, international socialist language, anti-racism, anti-xenophobia, inclusive of women. This amazing organization, which grew and grew from 1919 up until about 1927, from very modest beginnings in Cape Town with 20, 30 people in a drafty hall, into something with well over 100,000 members and completely dominating the news. It was the session of Parliament in 1926 was referred to as the Kadalie session. The White Parliament was talking about the ICU all the time. It was reported in the Times of London. It was reported in the major newspapers in the United States. It really was an extraordinary phenomenon and gave immense amount of hope to Black Southern African workers. That had fell apart within another 3-4 years and was fragmented by 1930, I don't think is the main point of the ICU. It is just something that was, as I say, from the vantage point of 1919, unpredictable, and its rapid rise from nowhere bears testimony, I suppose, to the capacity of people to struggle, to prevail, to struggle collectively, to produce real resistance, meaningful resistance to what was in a very oppressive economic system and political system. So it's a story, I think, ultimately of hope. That is, however bleak things are, there have been moments in Southern African history where people have come together and produced something quite miraculous, really, in retrospect. And I suppose, again, coming back to how to refute the suggestion that this material is boring, the variety of people who were involved in the ICU is what, for me, is so much of the attraction. Kadalie himself is an amazing orator. He's incredibly charismatic. He has a wonderful turn of phrase, but so did so many of the other people who wrote and were involved with the ICU, most famously the novelist Winifred Holtby, who again is a wonderful turn of phrase. But also people, the other leaders like Champion, Diable Mote, James Tayele. So many of the ICU leaders had been steeped not only in Christian theological language, but were also quite well read. They read poetry, they read literature, and they also generated their own metaphors, their own vocabulary of freedom, and so a lot of the stuff you read, I think, is animated by a kind of vitality, and sometimes very vituperative, very, very vicious. I mean, the trading of insults is also something that's always entertaining to read. And my God, there are insults that are second to none in the canon of ICU documents. So there are some of the reasons why it attracts. I'd encourage the members and the readers of the volume to venture beyond and dip in and see. I think it'd be hard to resist the charm and the power of the language and the writing that is included in the volume.
Yes, this is what I felt too. Could you say something to us about Clements Kadalie? Because here was this man who is a Malawian, came from Nyasaland, didn't speak South African languages, and yet he was able to hold these audiences, speak to people, appeal to people so successfully.
Yes, I mean, he is one of the great Southern African leaders of the 20th century, and very strikingly, I mean, it is an amazing organization in its Pan-Africanist reach that he did establish branches in 6 Southern African countries, not simply South Africa, and that he came, as you say, as a kind of outsider from what was then called Nyasaland, mission educated, very good looking, very dapper, very well dressed, and just with a personal charisma that everybody who saw him, C.L.R. James, the famous Trinidadian Marxist anti-colonial writer, referred to him as one of the great orators of the 20th century. So he had a capacity to draw people to him, to inspire people, to inspire struggle, but at the same time was deeply flawed. Wasn't great at the detail of organization, was at times not very good with money, clearly like life's luxuries, drank too much, was accused of womanizing. And actually what's I suppose what's an exciting sequel to our volume is Henry D, my fantastic co-editor, has got a biography of Kadalie coming up, which has just gone to the publisher now. With Liverpool University Press, and I'm sure a Southern African edition will be coming out soon. So there's so much more to learn about Kadalie, but he's interesting, as much for his achievements as for his failures. And I suppose what the volume tries to do in looking over the span of the 10 years is to present Kadalie's not only his own words, but also obviously what other people said about him. And I've often thought of the volume as a bit like a modernist novel, where you read different accounts of the same person, of the same events from different perspectives, and you as the reader, it's really up to you to judge which is the most plausible and to assemble your own sense of what Kadalie was like. And he is a very contradictory and controversial character. It's interesting, there were speeches by Blade and Zamandi a few years ago where he accused a rival union, AMCU, of Kadalieism. As a Communist Party stalwart, and so Kadalie's shadow prevails to the present, and people in the ruling Congress Alliance still find the ICU and the figure of Kadalie somehow threatening as representing an alternative tradition that needs to be humiliated, spurned, mocked. So I think, as I say, I think his interest is far more than simply historical. He remains a kind of reminder of a different route that our politics could have taken, one that was committed to a kind of, as I say, a kind of internationalism, stronger socialist language and commitments, and a different, a different dream of freedom, a different vision of what freedom would look like.
Yes. He wasn't, of course, the only notable member of the ICU, was he? There was somebody like Champion, for instance.
I mean, Champion's also so interesting, and both of them, are I think substantial intellectuals. They obviously were living incredibly busy lives, so they don't get time to sit at their desk and write an awful lot. But both Champion and Kadalie were very thoughtful. They both read and quoted poetry quite extensively, and they were able to formulate an analysis of Southern Africa in the 20s, of the segregationist state and how that state worked, how racism functioned, how the capitalist economy worked. And they were able to strategize in ways in order to try and resist that. And Champion was, very effective in Natal. He managed to get certain segregationist legislation repealed through the use of lawyers. And he rallied. I mean, at a point, the Natal branch of the ICU was the most important, the biggest, and the richest, and particularly in the rural areas of Natal was hugely influential. So Champion's also, a fantastically interesting person, and we've included quite long passages from his writings, both his published pamphlets and also his unpublished autobiography, which languishes still in the full thing deserves to be published, but is in Johannesburg in the Wits archive, Cullen Library archive. So, as you say, quite rightly, and there are others as well all of whom we've simply given people, if you like, a kind of a flavor of some of these people. And I suppose the dream would be that we might inspire other researchers to spend more time with them. Henry's now done the book on Kadalie, but there are many more of these leaders who would warrant further investigation and further study. And as I say, they left quite substantial written traces for people to follow up.
There are, of course, some biographies just for the information of people. For instance, the biography of Selby Msimang, who was both a member of the ANC and of the ICU. Absolutely. And a fascinating man.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Both Champion and Msimang on the more conservative side of the ICU, and again, that's part of the fascination of the ICU. Is much like, I suppose, the ANC or the Labour Party in Britain. It's a broad church, so there were figures of a very wide range of political convictions, from communism, Garveyism, through to people who were even supportive of segregationism, many what were called moderates or liberals, and trying to find and meld them together into a united front was obviously incredibly difficult, and that was sustained for several years, but ultimately failed, and was obviously key in the final fall and fragmentation of the ICU.
One of the things that is so striking about the volume, we know that the vast majority of members of the ICU were illiterate. The literacy rates in South Africa, Black literacy rates were very, very, the literacy rates were very low, illiteracy rates were very high. And yet this is an incredibly literate organization. They published a newspaper, and when you read their own writings, they're absolutely, there's the poetry, but full of references to all sorts of people like, Marcus Garvey, but Eamon de Valera, for instance, Mustafa Kemal Pasha, Mirabeau, Napoleon, Toussaint Louverture. It's an extraordinary range of people come through in their references.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, the Workers' Herald, which was the newspaper of the ICU, and ran through most of the decade and had several editors, stopped and started a few times. At its peak, had around 27,000 sold 27,000 copies per issue. And what it had as well was what book historians call follow-on readers. So there were lots of people who would buy the Workers' Herald and then would read it to the illiterate members of their family or to other workers. So it was certainly reaching huge numbers of people. But because there were so many, because it was such a broad church, there were many different people writing for the Workers' Herald, and you would have somebody like Ethel Reader Lewis, who had a column called The Bookshelf, which had almost in most issues she had a column which would reproduce quotes from the Harlem Renaissance, her favorite William Blake, and other, often she was very conservative herself, had very conservative literary tastes as well, but nonetheless circulated some remarkable poetry, and Kadalie himself, he loved to quote poems. So he loved to quote. He rewrote at one point the famous First World War poem in Flanders Fields. I've just, we're in Flanders Fields where poppies grow, the poem by John McCrae. After 20 ICU workers were killed in 1920, he rewrote the poem to suit the occasion in Port Elizabeth, this killing of 20 ICU workers, the murdered black workers. He says, "We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in the trenched graveyard. So he changes the last word. Instead of in Flanders Fields, he makes a reference to the deaths in Port Elizabeth. So he's appropriating this vivid language all the time in order to engage his readers, in order to draw them in. And he loved his favorite poem that he repeated over and over again is Invictus, which was Mandela's favorite poem, of course, and the movie
Yes.
with
Indeed.
the rugby victory celebrated
That's right.
Hollywood style. It was Kadalie's favorite poem, which he kept quoting over and over again, and again has a resonance obviously for many of his readers, because it's about overcoming adversity and prevailing through kind of collective struggle. So yeah, reading the Workers' Herald, I mean, again, just to emphasize the scale and size of the ICU and its publications, the other competing black newspapers of the period would sell 2,000 or 3,000 copies. There were Umtatweli, Babantu, there were tiny readerships in circulation by comparison, completely out, swamped by the scale of the ICU's publications and its reach and its inclusion of a really large reading community. Yeah, and I think, we've, between Henry and me, Henry was heroic in assembly. It's very hard to assemble a full set. There are still missing copies and editions of the ICU, but most of them are available. And not only these, these polemical essays, these articles, opinion pieces, also the fantastic cartoons by John Scott, many of which we've reproduced in the volume, which are obviously especially important for the illiterate workers who would have held the magazine in their hands and would have been, I think, fired up by these really clever cartoons that Scott produced. So yeah, I think lots to appreciate in the writings of the ICU.
Yes, it's quite extraordinary. Another feature of the ICU that is so striking and so unusual is the incorporation of women so early on. And the ANC didn't allow women in into the 1930s.
No, that's right. I mean, and there were not, I mean, a third of the members were women. They had women members right from the outset, right from the early 1920s. And women were not only were they, just rank and file members, there were many very remarkable women in positions of leadership, especially in Natal. And there are quite a few women who published in the Workers' Herald in isiZulu. So we were very determined to have their articles, their points of view translated and reproduced in the volume, and really quite unique insights, with some of them critical of Kadalie's patriarchal leadership style, pointing out gaps and failures, and also, right through the period, right up until right until the end of the decade, the beer hall protests in Durban, led very much by women members of the ICU. So we've been very conscientious in representing their words as fully as possible right through the entire period. And I mean, it's I think what's also kind of I think it's also important to appreciate is the women members, much like the men members, represented a wide range of political views. So some of the women members of the ICU were conservative, some of them were more radical. There's no necessary correlation, not all women were more left-wing. So I think each of them have to be read in their own terms, read carefully, and being quite alive to the contradictions that each of those women members were trying to negotiate, because some of them were both trade union members and then trying to run small businesses. There was a material struggle for survival throughout this period, and people had to improvise accordingly. But yeah, the presence of women is one of the, that I would say, and also the importance of non-South African members of the ICU are the two legacies I would emphasize above all else, actually, when thinking about the significance of the ICU.
Yes, some particularly. We'll come to that in a moment. But I was also thinking, the people who are the most difficult to organize are rural workers. They're scattered on farms. Very difficult to create a union movement with rural workers. And yet this was also where the ICU flourished.
No, absolutely. And it's particularly in the period after 1925, 1926. Up in the first half of the decade, it was very much a Cape-centered organization. At the annual Congress in 23, I think 30 of the 31, 32 branches were based in the Cape. But by the second half of the decade, there was an amazing recruitment drive in Tel, in the Orange Free State, in Basotho land, as it was then called Lesotho, of rural workers. And it was to do with the fact that sharecroppers and tenant farmers were being driven off the land, either being forced to become wage laborers or driven to the cities. So the material hardships of rural workers intensified in the second half, and were perfect, if you like, material for recruitment into the ICU. And there were very, very energetic unsung heroes of the ICU who went to the farms, who went into these these rural areas to recruit ICU members, and placed pressure on white farm owners, who lashed back in really quite vicious ways, especially in northern Natal, where there were race riots, that again, the violence of the segregationist state and through white vigilante groups were always a check on the progress and the capacity of the ICU to take the organization further and to further the rights of workers beyond a certain point. So they came up and really challenged that hegemony. Unfortunately, couldn't sustain that challenge at the time. The material conditions, if you like, were so very, very unpropitious. It was an uphill struggle.
In relation to that, the ICU is also operating in both a larger national and international context. What about their relations with the Communist Party of South Africa, for instance? Because the Communist Party was perhaps the most stringently organized of these protest organizations in the 1920s.
Yeah, absolutely, Elizabeth. I mean, maybe just to span before getting to the Communist Party. I mean, we've sort of summarized there, if you like, three really important Northern Hemisphere traditions of radical traditions. There was the Garvey movement, which was a strong influence in the early 1920s. And then there was the Communist Party through obviously the Russian Revolution is only 1917. It's within 10 years of the Russian Revolution and the kind of idealism that triggered. And then through the Comintern and then through the Communist Party of South Africa, a workers' organization, the Communist Party were very, very anxious and eager to take advantage of the recruitment, the resources that the ICU garnered so very quickly. So there were a number of important Communist Party leaders, Johnny Gomez, Laguma, and others who were members both of the Communist Party and the ICU. But it was a kind of uneasy and fractious relationship that eventually broke down in 1926 when Laguma published a very critical report on all of the branches. And he went through, I mean, it's an amazing document. It's actually, I think, again, just an incredibly interesting snapshot of the organization. And we've published quite a large extract from that in the volume, where he goes from branch to branch. And what it really makes you appreciate is also how very different the different parts of South Africa were in the 1920s. And he's very good at kind of capturing the specificities of the different branches. But that obviously didn't go down well with Kadalie and the leadership. And there was a power struggle, which led to adopting a kind of commitment that nobody could belong to both organizations, which effectively expelled all the communists. So all those members of the Communist Party left, and the period after it was December 1926, their expulsion. The period after that then becomes increasingly dominated by what we would call the moderate faction. So people like Tyamzashe, Kadalie himself, champion, although he also fragments and leaves in 1928. But the moderates become the most influential faction after the expulsion of the communists. But the Communist Party, it does feel like a kind of missed opportunity that had the two organizations been, I don't know, you can't play these kind of what if games with history, really. That's what happened, and that's what happened. But it does look like one of these moments of missed opportunity. And certainly, important Communist Party intellectuals like Eddie Roux when they reflected back on the 1920s, that was very much the tenor of sadness, that the ICU represented this huge opportunity for advancing the interests and the material conditions of workers that was missed simply through poor organization, through a failure to evolve the right strategies to work collectively, effectively. So that is a key moment in the history of the ICU, that 1926 expulsion. And the again, if you're looking for high quality insults, those few pages are the pick of the bunch, I would say, where Chamzashe representing the center and Johnny Gomez and Laguma trade insults over several pages, blaming each other for the failure entirely. So yeah, interesting reading.
Because the Comintern lurks in the background, of course, also.
Very much so. And that's a very important thing. I mean, that's a very important thing. Whether you know, African trade union struggles can in fact be scripted from Moscow. And again, this is a criticism that many commentators on the history of the ICU make of the Communist Party, that it was far too dominated by following Comintern directives generated in abstract far away, that were really not attuned to the realities on the ground in Southern Africa. So that's a really important point. That's a really important criticism.
This is also, of course, a period of white labor unrest. There were the 1922 miners' strikes, is the best known of them. But what about the relationship between black workers and white workers?
Elizabeth, perhaps predictably, it's a depressing story. You know, there were hopes, certainly in the early 1920s, where Kadalie makes overtures again and again to the South African Labour Party. And in fact, in the 1924 election, when Smuts is defeated and the packed government get into power, Kadalie campaigned energetically on behalf of Hertzog and Cresswell. He really wanted, you know, Hertzog and Cresswell to win, because he saw them representing white labor, and by extension, he hoped and dreamed black labor. He hoped that that would happen. Unfortunately, within a year, there's the famous Smithfield speech that Hertzog gives. The dreams of the ICU, of certainly Kadalie's, I'm not sure how widespread they were, but Kadalie's dreams of any kind of coalition between white and black labor absolutely shattered. And from that point on, there are very, very few cases of black and white labor acting in concert in any meaningful way. There are occasional moments where individual white leaders show some kind of compassion, understanding, seek solidarity with black workers and with the ICU, but they're very rare occasions. We've identified them in the book, but as I say, the overwhelming exception is that under segregation, the white labor movement, there's a very arresting comment by David Iron Jones, the communist laborer, a Marxist, early Marxist, a member of the Communist Party, where he says, you know, given the choice between this, you know, solidarity between black and white workers, the white trade unions are always going to throw in their lot with white capital and settle for a segregationist political dispensation. He puts it very pithily and very accurately. So that's the depressing story of a kind of, you know, a failure, if you like, of cross-racial solidarity amongst the kind of working class. Although certainly, you know, the images in the you know, the images drawn by Scott in the Workers' Herald continue to hold out that hope. If you like, the ICU continue to hold out that hope that white workers will join them. And they often have images of white workers from Europe or from North America being part of an international fraternity, or working class fraternity. But as far as white South African workers go, that simply doesn't happen, and it becomes, by the end of the decade, unimaginable.
Yes, it's an interesting comment on the way in which ethnic values and loyalties can work against a natural loyalty relationships between people who are sharing the same concerns as far as work is concerned.
Absolutely, and I mean it's obviously something that's very skillfully manipulated by the white ruling class, if you like, the divide and rule strategies that use those divisions and exploit them and expand them to the detriment of any kind of unified collective working class struggle. So yeah.
Something that's always, I felt I've never really got a handle on properly was the ICU relationship with the so-called South African liberals. And I'm thinking here of the Institute of Race Relations and Reinhold Jones and those various mission interests, those sort of people who were very fond of, were keen to see Black upliftment, were very fond of giving advice to Black people. But I have a sense that they were not comfortable with the ICU. Would I be wrong?
That's a fair summary, I think, and I think by far the most energetic and perhaps the most interesting representative of that particular faction would probably be Ethelreda Lewis, the novelist, who was a conservative segregationist, but still, as you say, cared about improving the lives of Black people. She romanticized especially Black rural people. She wanted to keep Black South Africans away from the cities, keeps them in a state of rural innocence, as she saw it. And her energies were therefore directed very much into trying to influence Kadalie away from communism, away from Garveyism, and into a kind of, if you like, a kind of paternalistic dispensation where white and Black relations through a kind of gradualist, paternalism would be accommodated. And the idea is I suppose, a form of trusteeship, perhaps. Very, very slowly, in her view, Black workers would be civilized, would be educated, would very, very slowly and very much on the terms of these white Christian, Race Relations Institute, very much on the terms of the white liberal, would be accommodated and included into a polity, both as workers and then ultimately, I suppose, as citizens. This was a vision of a very, very slow, step-by-step process by which Black South Africans could be contained, accommodated. But the ICU, because it was such it included people with such fiery rhetoric, such angry expressions of despair at the plight of their members, that clearly would have been very, very unsettling for somebody like Ethelreda Lewis. And we've got 3 or 4 of her letters. It's interesting to me. I mean, today it's fairly unthinkable that a novelist, a relatively minor novelist, would write letters to the Prime Minister and to the leader of the opposition and to the head of trade unions and tell them what to do. But Ethelreda Lewis had no qualms about doing just that and writing letters to Kadalie and telling him what to do. So we have this very clear expression of her vision, her dreams of a kind of, as I say, a kind of gradual, very, very slow integration of Black South Africans into a common citizenry and a common polity.
Yes, her romanticism and the contradictions come through in that rather odd novel that she wrote called Wild Deer, where she has a sort of Paul Robeson-like figure coming to South Africa and ultimately marrying a very simple Black girl from the rural areas.
No, it is a very strange novel. It is a very strange novel, and she has, as you know, in the novel, there's a hybrid of various, there's a hybrid Kadalie figure. She does include the important characters from the 1920s in the novel in very, very thinly disguised form. As I say, there's a kind of conservative romanticism which goes back to the German romantics in the late 18th century, I suppose, and she would belong in that line. Although, her favorite poet is William Blake, who's hardly a conservative. So I'm not quite sure how her mental furniture was juggling all of that.
Yes, I sometimes think that her natural human instincts ran counter to her intellectual instincts, as it were, intellectual thinking.
I think also one important key to understanding her was how fearful she was. And again, in that respect, very typical of white South Africans of the period. The ICU rose so incredibly quickly, was dominated by this fiery language, and to people like her, I think it's fear that that lies at the root of her responses to that. And as you say, a certain paternalistic kindness, certainly, but also a fear of revolution, basically, because all the signs of revolution are there. And again, it's kind of remember it's within 10 years of the Russian Revolution. It is a decade of massive global upheavals if people look beyond the borders of South Africa. And why not, you can imagine they're saying, why not here? If nobody thought it would happen in Russia in 1917, perhaps it can happen here as well. So I think that fear is very important to register.
Mm-hmm. Ethelreda Lewis, of course, was one of the 3 white women who became deeply involved in the ICU and were very, very supportive of Kadalie. The other 2 being the English novelist Winifred Holtby and Mabel Palmer, who was in Durban, of course, and there is now a residence at the University of Natal named after her. Otherwise, people don't know her name anymore at all. And Winifred Holtby is not known in South Africa. British people know her mainly for her friendship with Vera Brittain and for her novel South Riding, which she wrote while she was dying. But it's the fascination that they had with Kadalie, and also their sense that Africans needed a modern trade union movement, a movement which was associated with the Labour Party or the Independent Labour Party in Britain and with the international labour movement, is intriguing.
Yes, no, I think you're right. I mean, all 3 of them are really interesting. Both Mabel Palmer and Winifred Holtby far more left-wing than Ethelreda Lewis, but there are also very interesting differences between Mabel Palmer and Winifred Holtby as well. So all 3 of them again deserve to be read, I think. Winifred Holtby, I think she came for a 6-month lecture tour in 1926 and then was instrumental in bringing the Scottish trade unionist William Ballinger, who played a major role in union history subsequently, in 1928, pretty much once the ICU had already fragmented. I mean, he was on a hiding to nothing in his attempts. His personality also didn't help. Quite an abrasive character by most accounts. But yeah, the friendships that Kadalie managed to sustain, and there was a woman, Dorothy Woodford, in England as well. I know Henry. I've just spoken to him recently in his biography, which is due out next year, has come up with all sorts of fairly reliable stories. I suppose we might call them superior gossip about what Kadalie, his womanizing and his relationships with these different women. There's far more to it than the written record we've seen to date suggests. So there's a lot more to learn about those relationships. But I think the one key thing you're saying is this idea of modernizing. For all 3 of them, they do believe that ultimately that Britain is at an advanced stage of civilization, and Black South Africans are at a much earlier stage, and they see their role as, if you like, accelerating Black South African trade unions along that road to catch up, if you like, with Britain, with British trade unions. So they have a clear sense in their heads of a kind of teleology, of a kind of direction of travel for Black trade unions, which, when you read it now, does come across as really quite racist and unpleasant at times. This failure to respect, if you like, the specificities of South African history, of Black South African life and what that society involved. So there are, on the one hand, you read somebody like Palmer and Holtby, and you're rooting for them because they seem so refreshingly passionate in their desire for equality. On the other hand, they can come across as tremendously patronizing and painfully condescending, and really failing, if you like, as well, to appreciate the achievements of the ICU in its own terms. And this conviction that they have, which is that without their help, the ICU will die. They're very, very confident about how indispensable they are to the ICU's trajectory. And I suppose when we read the history now, we would be much more inclined to say the ICU were the agents of their own history. In a way, these white people helping them were very much part of the supporting cast, but in their heads, they are the stars of the show. And it's, yeah, I think it makes for quite uncomfortable reading. There's one very, very interesting letter, which I was very keen to include in the volume from Winifred Holtby to Kadalie at a point when he's on his tour of London. It's a letter where she says to him, I can't give you £3,000 to buy a new printing press. That's the one thing. It's far too much money. You should spend the money on court cases helping your members. And then the second thing she says is, you mustn't drive around London spending all the union's money on taxis and expensive booze. And on the one hand, you can see her point, and she's right that a trade union leader should, think in these terms. But on the other hand, it does read a bit like a white telling the black servant what to do, and it's very unpleasant. And yes. I think that very uncomfortable relationship is worth reflecting on, because I think unless you, I think what you need to do, and I suppose again, and that's what I'm hoping we've done with the volume, you switch in the next extract to reading Kadalie writing in his own voice, and you start to think, well, he doesn't really deserve to be treated and spoken to in that way, because he's a substantial, sophisticated, highly intelligent trade union leader. So I think yeah, it's for people. I hope people, when they read that, you'll sometimes get seduced by one particular writer, and then you'll move to the next one, and I hope it'll have the effect, because it has that effect on me, of jolting your assumptions and your certainties, and you'll think, wow, I've got to think about this from a very different angle, because the truth doesn't lie with Winifred Holtby or any one single witness to what that history, as it unfolded.
Yes, quite. It was Winifred Holtby and the British Unionists who recruited William Ballinger essentially to come out to South Africa and help to organize the ICU. He came in, of course, in the latter stages of the ICU in the late 1920s. I wonder if you could say something about him, because, of course, William Ballinger and above all his wife, Margaret Ballinger, went on to be notable figures in South African liberal history, I suppose you could term it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very good biography of the Ballingers, which we drew on very heavily, and people have published excellent research on the Ballingers, because they did have such a long and interesting careers in South African sort of trade union and political history. I suppose for me, I mean, his period with the ICU was pretty disastrous. I mean, the Cape Town branch of the ICU, he arrived in 1928. In 1928, already, I think the Cape Town branch had seceded from the main ICU. And by the end of 1928, the biggest branch, the Natal branch, had also seceded. So, as he was there writing, it was falling apart, and there was absolutely, I don't think, anything he could have done. He was, abrasive. But I think the thing that again, these people's histories are never simple. He could be cast, I suppose, as a kind of overconfident Scottish trade unionists coming to sort out the natives, if you like, in his terms. But the early letters between him and Winifred Holtby are very interesting, because you get a sense of he's growing up having a really grim, difficult life himself. Very poor Scottish working class in Motherwell, really struggling against terrible bosses, terrible economic and political oppression, exploitation. And he develops a kind of trade union consciousness, a desire for equality for workers, a desire to improve the material conditions. And it's clearly utterly sincere. And reading him within his own world, again, you find yourself rooting for him. When somebody from Scotland, from Britain, is then transposed into a colonial setting, and they bring those same commitments to bear in an utterly different labour landscape, they mean very, very different things. And he means something different. He's in a position of power. He's dealing with workers who aren't literate. They are suspicious of him. And how he flounders and how he struggles with that, I think is fascinating. And I would, again, with all these people, I would hesitate to rush to quick and easy judgments, because the world that they were grappling with was really, really difficult. And he certainly was dealt the worst possible hand. Even with a better hand, it's not clear whether, I mean, one of the questions is, was the segregation at state and capital at that point simply so powerful that there's no way the ICU could have succeeded? And I think that's a fair argument. They were really up against it. They didn't help themselves by splitting, by internecine faction fights, by poor money management, by maladministration, and all these things. But the state was very powerful, and Ballinger, insofar as he was barely ever paid. Most of the time he was being paid from Winifred Holtby raising money to pay him from England. The odds were heavily stacked against him. So there's a certain, one has a grudging admiration for his stamina, basically. I mean, it's incredible that he was able to keep going and keep fighting.
Do you think that the ICU could ever have succeeded in South Africa of the 1920s and 30s? Do you not think perhaps the government and the emphasis on segregation was just so powerful in that period? Or
I suppose
do you think
the way,
in other words, yeah. No,
I mean,
sorry, go ahead.
No, you carry on.
No, I was just going to add on and say, was it just the fact that they fell apart as far as poor administration was concerned, corruption, Kadalie's drinking, those sort of things, or was the context just impossible?
It's an impossibly difficult question. The way I've tended to think about it, I mean, there's something I've written else. There's something tragic about this, and lots of people have cast the collapse of the ICU as a tragedy for Southern Africa's working class. And if you see it as a tragedy, then I suppose you'd have to assume that it could have been something different, that it could have taken a different route. I suppose I'm slightly, for me, in a way, the tragedy is not so, well, it is a tragedy that the ICU collapsed. It's a terrible thing. It would have been great if they'd have won more concessions for workers. They'd have, established an enduring working class trade union movement that continued and got stronger and stronger through the 30s and 40s and 50s. But I suppose for me, what the saddest thing about it is that, organizations, they bear certain values, and the values of the ICU were rights for women workers, were rights for workers of all nations of Southern Africa, not just South Africans. They were very, very vigorous in taking on the ANC's xenophobia in the 1920s. And I suppose for me, the loss of those values losing priority through the 30s, 40s, 50s, if you like, as a result of the ICU collapsing, was the greater sadness. What would have been, I suppose I often think that, Kadalie's idealism, the idealism of the ICU leadership, its language of international socialism, its language of including workers from all industries, men and women, rural and urban, was inspiring. And what it was replaced by, with the ANC gradually and the Communist Party gaining hegemony, was a much more gradual attention to women workers, but also a much more nationalist language of liberation. So that for me, and that nationalist language of liberation, which replaces the internationalism of the 20s with the ICU, we live with the consequences of that in the present, with the xenophobia we live with in the present, because it's a century, if you like, of African National Congress, which is, as I say, a South African exclusive South African nationalism. So those two elements, I think, which, you know, the ICU was so exemplary in emphasizing that kind of a kind of popular front, a trade union, broad church. Those particular combination of commitments, their loss was the major defeat, if you like, of the ICU. And I don't think in its form, you know, perhaps it could have survived. I can't really. I find it very hard to answer that, actually. I find it very hard.
Well, you partly answered what was going to be my last question, which is the value of the ICU for us today, because we're living in such, right now, of course, we've got elections this year. We've got the emergence of a whole lot of political parties we haven't seen before, like Razm Zanzi and Musi Maimani's party and that sort of thing, which are coming from very different directions from the ANC. I wondered whether people like that could learn something from the ICU. Of what interest could it be to modern South Africa? I think you partly answered my question.
Yeah, maybe I have. I think the thing about the ICU is that it represents to me absolute irrefutable proof, evidence, that there are different routes to freedom, that there are different ways of political organizations, trade union organizations, organizing with a different set of priorities, with a different language, with a different set of commitments to the one that is, if you like, a kind of exclusive nationalism and a kind of very slightly ameliorated capitalist economy. There are ways of thinking about South African society, Southern African society, in ways that are different to the ANC vision. And the ICU, for me, is the most vivid reminder of that. And I suppose that's why I think I would like people to read about them and to discover those possibilities. That would be that's the reason we did the book, really. And we're so grateful to HIPSA for publishing it, because those are the ideas that I suppose we care about and would like circulated, those kinds of commitments, those kinds of ideas. Quite whether, you know, you can make the connections across a century without lots of qualifications, that's a much harder question. But the fact of the ICU's incredible success in 1927, I suppose I would like to think it should inspire any people, you know, from 1919 to 1927, should inspire any constituency of working class, unemployed, poor people anywhere. The change is possible, and that organizations can emerge that will further those aspirations and those dreams.
As we conclude this enlightening journey through the corridors of history, remember that you can be a part of preserving these invaluable narratives. Together, let's continue to uncover, honor, and celebrate the hidden histories that shaped our land. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, stay curious.